Well, welcome everyone to our talk by Dr. Pedro Fidelman, who's at the UQ Center for Policy Futures. Pedro is a senior research fellow with the Center for Policy Futures, where he co-leads the design and delivery of UQ's component of the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program and the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Center. He was a lead author on chapters on oceans and coastal policy and policy theory and practice for the UN Global Environmental Outlook 6. And Pedro today is going to be talking about biodiversity and conservation, science and policy futures, and opportunities for collaboration. So, welcome. I hope it goes really well. I'm sorry I have to enter a meeting.
Thanks, Amelia.
But yes, please enjoy.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. As I mentioned in the morning tea, the main motivation for the presentation today is to explore opportunities for collaboration between the CBCS and the Center for Policy Futures. Many of you may have heard about the centers. Some of you may have engaged with staff in the center in collaborative projects and other activities. But there's still around UQ you'll find people who never heard about the Center for Policy Futures. And so that's the main motivation for today. So I'm going to start with this slide. It was actually a slide I used 2 years ago when I gave a presentation on governance of social ecological systems in the same seminar series. So if you look at the main pressing conservation issues, like biodiversity loss, climate change, overexploitation of natural resources. They are complex issues involving very complex social and ecological interactions. So addressing these issues will require efforts from a wide range of disciplines, such as conservation ecology, social science, and today I'm going to make a case of policy scholarship of political science. And drawing on the experience of the Center for Policy Futures, we're going to explore some, as I said, opportunities for collaboration. So, policy. So policy can play a major role in terms of mediating human-environment interactions. For example, determining how we use and manage biodiversity resources. Mainly through policy instruments like the establishment of marine protected areas, payment for existing services, and other instruments, we can regulate, we can determine what, how, where, who should be involved in conservation, who benefits from conservation, and who pays the cost for conservation. So that's the sort of the overall role of policy in this context. But policy is one of those words that means different things to different people. So, people outside the political science discipline or public administration, they have all sort of ideas about policy. So policy, in this case, we're talking about public policy. And there are also various definitions, but they all revolve around the notion of an objective or course of action planned by the government. So this notion, however, does not entirely capture the dynamic nature of policy making. Does not capture the policy as a process. So I have talked to people that said, "Oh, no, policy is a statement. Okay, policy is the legislation. Policy is this and that." But few people have an idea of policy in terms of a process or a cycle. And you may, particularly those working on the science policy interface, you may be familiar with this diagram. was the policy cycle that described the policy process as discrete steps. It's very neat. It's very very simplistic, and it's deceiving because policy doesn't take place like this. Policy is messy, and in reality, sometimes some of these stages they happen simultaneously. It's difficult to recognize sometimes it's difficult to recognize when one begins and the other one finishes, the other begins. So it's very deceiving model, but it's being useful in terms of scholarship or to explain the policy process in a simple way. And what else I want to say here? Yeah, so I'm saying this is very simple, and there are several policy models that explain policy, the messiness and the complexity. And if you're studying policy, you're better off using one of those. But this is something that you may be familiar. So this policy cycle, for example, doesn't tell us much about the values involved, contested values involved in policy making. Doesn't tell us much about the participants in the policy process. Doesn't tell us about the role of these participants in the policy process as well. And importantly, it does not explain or produce testable hypotheses on how policy is made and how policy changes or does not change. So I'm just going to go through very quickly through some of the concepts that I've just touched on. Values, policy-making futures, contested values, which are related to how participants in environmental policy perceive the seriousness of the problems, but also the preferred solutions to those problems. So it involves governments, different levels of governments. They have different mandates. So governments have different mandates of a range of policy sectors that affect directly or indirectly conservation efforts and outcomes. We have a range of actors, policymakers, administrators, both at local, state, and federal level. You have the favorite politician. So politicians usually determine, they are the primary responsible for policy making. So in response to a range of factors, they may decide if environmental policy becomes more protective or more permissive. And this is in part in response to concerns of their constituents. By the way, they need to be re-elected to follow the policy goals. So these are some examples. I don't know if you remember, it's back in 2012 when there was a bit of controversy over the establishment and planning of the Australia's marine reserves network. So there was, some of the politicians sidelined with the fishermen that was opposed to the creation of the marine park. It was actually, if I'm not wrong, was Labour that established it. At the time, was one of the largest marine reserves in the world. And then they started the planning process, and then they lost the election. The Liberals got in, and then they decided to redo the planning process again, and there was a bit of controversy with those for and against the establishment of these marine protected areas. So although politicians are the primary responsible for policy making, participants outside the government shape the context in which policy is made. So we have interest groups, advocacy organizations, experts, media. For example, the media, they can promote, reject, or modify the way the problems is framed by advocates. So, despite the main responsibility for policy making lies on politicians, and this context is so much important First, politicians, sometimes they react to public opinion, to their constituents, to the media. So that's where the process gets messy. And these advocacy groups, they form coalitions, depending on the value and on their values and the problem at stake. When I saw this picture, I thought it was really interesting, because they protesting against the single gas industry, coal seam gas industry. And usually you have farmers and environmentalists in opposing ends. And in this picture, you have the farmers with the greens, you have the conservative characters like Alan Jones and Bob Carter. So it's very atypical coalition, because usually they opposing ends. So what I was trying to do with these very general considerations about some of the policy elements was to introduce the Center for Policy Futures. So what I've been talking about is that's the space where we operate. It's public policy. One of the main aims of the center is to undertake robust, rigorous research to help governments to meet policy challenges. Within UQ, the center positions the university to inform policy debate and priorities across Queensland, Australia, and internationally. So it's a lot of engagement with different units, schools, in terms of because one of the other main thing with the center is that in addition to the traditional research outputs, the center focus on non-traditional outputs, especially trying to influence policy making an impact on decision making. So it's involved in, I'm going to talk a little bit later, involved in a lot of engagement with government and industry in trying to, hope to improve policy making. So the center comprises a small team of the core staff. Is a small team, and the main focus of the center is not only environmental policy, but includes science and technology. Sustainable development goals is where environmental policy sits currently. Trade, foreign, and security policy, and most of these topics, they have to varying degrees and importance for conservation. At the moment, we are in the process of reviewing these research areas. So sustainable development goals will change it to something like sustainability. There will be probably there'll be another area on policy analysis methods. What else? Well, we do research, engagement, capacity building. Much of the research focuses on policy analysis. For example, SWOT analysis of existing policies. We work a lot with governments, trying to help them to develop policies or developing policy options. We also do assessment of policy impact on industry and community, and we also involved in stakeholder analysis and engagement. So beyond research, as I said, there's a lot of engagement with government and industry. These parliamentary briefings is it happens every few months. So the center organizes a presentation with experts, not necessarily from the center, but drawing on UQ expertise on a topic that is relevant timely relevant for the government, and they go and present to the MPs. And sometimes we get good feedback. Some MPs would follow up with the staff and experts presenting. So it's another way of trying to influence policy making. What else? There's the parliamentary submissions. The Centre is actively trying to engage in parliamentary submissions. Again, not necessarily driven by the Centre, but providing support to other schools, to other academics, to prepare and submit the submissions. So in this context, the Centre has developed step-by-step guidelines to making a submission to a public inquiry. This is what it looks like. It's available on the internet. You can go to the Centre website and you can download it. But also, if you need help with submissions, the staff in the Centre would be happy to help you. Training, that's the other thing that we do, research, engagement, training. This is a course that I don't know if there's any of you have attended this course. This is called GRIP, the Getting Research into Policy and Practice. It's a one-day workshop designed to help UQ researchers, includes HDR students, to navigate Australia's policy landscape and how to connect research with policy and program development. So it's offered every few months, twice a semester, 3 times a year, and helps to understand, what's the Australian government system look like and how it works, and the work and the organization and workings of the government, and if you want to make an impact or try to make an impact, influence decision making with your research, where should you go? What are the entry points? So it's a very interesting training course. We also developing another course on policy more generally, just to talk about policies, how it's made, policy implementation, just the basics of policy. So this is another, I was talking about non-traditional research outputs. This is a publication that the Centre was the inaugural issue of the Policy Futures. So if the idea is to every year we prepare a think piece, as we call it, covering a topical important issue in terms of policy making. So the first issue addressed regulating the new economy, addressing the challenges to regulate artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, nanotechnology, circular economy. Many of these technologies, they have direct implications for conservation, and I will talk about. I'll give an example just in the next slide. So this is the. You asked me at the morning tea that would be controversy in the talk, and I said no, but maybe there will be. So this is the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program. It's a 10-year research and development program where they seek to develop new technologies to help coral reefs to cope with climate change. So the rationale is that even if we meet the Paris target of 1.5 or 2 degrees, the coral reefs will be mostly gone. So the first thing, we need to stop carbon emissions now. But even if we stop now, the ocean will still get warmer. And coral reefs are struggling. So this program, as I said, they aim to develop these new technologies. And we, at the Center for Policy Futures, we are responsible for looking at the policy and regulatory implications of these new technologies. So this is from the feasibility phase of the study. The second phase was going to start July last year, but hopefully we're going to start July this year. So we look at the looking at the Great Barrier Reef as a case. We look at the regulatory implications of reef restoration and adaptation, including mapping the regulatory environment, scoping the regulatory issues, and examining the interventions they're considering to develop and implement. So just quickly, I won't provide much detail. This is what the governance landscape looks like. We mapped, the key legislation, regulations, policies, plans, and programs as they apply to reef restoration and adaptation. We developed a sort of a key or framework to see where the interventions will trigger in terms of legislation, depending on the location and nature of the activities associated with these interventions. And we also looked at the regulatory requirements and risks for reef restoration and adaptation. So quickly, the regulatory environment is not entirely fit for purpose. Of course, the existing policy and regulatory frameworks were developing in a time that we didn't think about using technological aid to help coral reefs. It's very complex, fragmented, overlapping, and its capacity to assess unconventional interventions is mostly limited. So achieving a more robust and enabling regulatory environment will require priorities to improve regulatory capacity. We've been working with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority in identifying the challenges that they're facing in this new reality and identifying the gaps and needs that they need to address in order to make sure that they are on the game in terms of measuring the risks and impacts of this kind of interventions. As I said, the second part of the reef adaptation restoration program will involve also guidelines and training for regulators. Cooperation between the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority and all the relevant regulators, and improving the permission system. So this is just some of recommendations that inform the second part of our research in terms of policy and regulatory inquiry. Okay, opportunities for collaboration. So I think the most, as I said, we share a lot in common in terms of interest in conservation, environmental policy, and that's the most obvious is it's developing collaborative research. Some of you, as I said, may already have engaged with the center in existing projects or in grant proposals and tenders. But in terms of research, this is something that I'm interested in terms of policy. So here, this is the traditional policy approach, right? We have policy and regulation, and they inform the conventional interventions in management to address conventional threats and hopefully get ecosystems back to historic baselines, right? But this is what we knew so far. But today we have unconventional threats, alter ecological states that's no longer feasible, like the Great Barrier Reef is no longer feasible to return the coral reef to the previous baseline. What we see now is scholars or scientists and managers proposing unconventional interventions like using technology, like genetic modification, management of solar radiation, and the like. And this policy that was created to address these contexts is the same that's being relied on to deal with this new reality. And it's not working, it's not going to work. So one interesting research question that I have is, what kind of policy regulation do we need to address this new reality that we live in? If we look at the policy assumptions for the traditional frameworks, we have reasonably stable environmental conditions, if you consider the Holocene as opposed to the Anthropocene, established science and technologies, and accepted ecological and social values. Now, in this reality, you highly disputed ecological and social values. So in the conservation community, as you know, people is debating if we should manage altered ecosystems, novel ecosystems, and hybrid ecosystems. Some argue that we should concentrate on restoring ecosystems to the previous baselines. So this is just unpacking the assumptions underneath the two policy paradigms. So this is something that is really interesting in terms of research. What kind of policy approach do we need to address this new reality, uncertainty, change, surprise? And I think so that was research. So just one example of how we can collaborate. So there is the group that getting research into practicing policy, and the policy workshop that we are developing. Some of you may already attended the course, but we also draw expertise from the conservation community. Megan presented a case, your experience in terms of dealing with the government and in one of the group training. Yeah. So that's where we can also, opportunity for collaboration, drawing on your experience in dealing with government and policy to talk to the participants. There's a scope for us to develop a workshop for focus on HDR within the CBCS, addressing policy, co-supervision of students, what else? Submissions and briefings, and teaching. I think I'll leave it there. And as I said, it's a discussion so we can explore opportunities for collaboration. Thank you.
Hi. I'm curious, you're referring to innovative policy and regulation, and what exactly you might have any ideas about what that might mean. I find, and I'm not suggesting that this is what you mean, but I find whenever someone refers to innovative policy instruments, they usually mean an economic instrument with a different name. So they're calling it, instead of an officer, they're calling it, I don't know, something else. And basically it usually just means a policy instrument that government has less of a role in administering. There might be some others in the audience with examples, but in terms of a brief, there's some interesting stuff happening with the complexity of the governance. We're seeing the role of government shrinking more and more and more, and other non-state actors actually creating and administering whole policy systems. What are some of the pros and cons of these kind of new forms of governance appearing, and what can we possibly do to inform that?
That's a good research question. No, what I mean by innovative policy is not, well, doesn't rule out economic instruments, but it's not the focus of innovative policy. It's policy that can be responsive, adaptive. There are a few examples at a very local level. They focus a lot on experimentation, but it's the antithesis of public policy, right? Policy that needs to be predictable, stable, so that we need to find a balance, between providing stability so that society can function and be flexible enough to respond to surprise, uncertainty, novel risks. So that's what I mean by, there's a lot of, in all the disciplines, they have a lot of examples in terms of, they started, they started with this term of innovative policy innovation. There's a lot on climate change. But one sector, the financial sector, is where you find a lot of innovation in terms of regulation, co-regulation, because of the global financial crisis. So they learned that model, the old model, was broken, and they need to find new ways of doing regulating, policy making, and establish standards in a way that was, could cope with, the uncertainty, would be flexible. So that's what and also if you look at the major global assessments, one of the lessons is that the traditional way that we make our policy frameworks, they're not working. We're not going to meet the biodiversity targets. We're not going to meet the sustainable development goals. In the global environmental book, there was a whole chapter, a few chapters, a whole section of policy chapters, and a few chapters talking about alternatives. So they talk about not replacing the traditional way, but having some sort of policy innovation they call transformative policy to realize transformative change. But these all, as I said, it's interesting in terms of research, because these exist at a very local level. How we scale up these kind of innovation is a good question. But we need to do something quick, and so that's where maybe looking at how all the sectors, like as I said, the financial sectors are coming up with this kind of innovation would be one entry point. Question.
Well, first, thanks for coming over and presenting to us. I personally am super interested in trying to find places to interact with Center for Policy Futures. I'm curious, with the sort of framework that you gave for new interventions and new problems, one of the things that seems, maybe two things that seem to be going on to me is, one, there's also more information about the way things are connected. And I think part of the change is in the information that's being provided, the speed at which the information is being provided, and the sort of increased connectivity that we see because of that information, right? And so I'd be really curious to hear more about how, even local examples, Queensland's or councils, how they're dealing with the fact that it's really hard to make decisions by yourself these days because of the amount of connectivity we have between the problems that are being generated. Is there a place for that in this? Do you see that happening? Increases in communication between sort of across scales of government, but also just regionally to deal with some of these problems, or is it still super static?
I think there's the overall picture is that because of how the Australian system of government, where it's there's a lot of concurrence between state and federal government, and I think, I don't know how it's like in the West. I think there's a similar tension between federal and state government, but they, in certain areas, they work well together. Sometimes I was going to say the fire emergency until then was one of the examples where the state emergency services would work with the federal government. But there's some examples, but there's still there are tensions as well. So that's part of the part of innovation. It's not much innovation, but fostering collaboration across different levels of government and across different agencies would be something, yeah.
Right, thanks. Great talk. You sort of presented a rational approach to policy development, as though governments are rational. So, for example, I saw a rational approach to policy development when Robert Hill decided he would create the PBC Act. And he's a lawyer, and very smart, and he saw a lot of regulations, and he created the matters of national environmental significance, and then he framed a policy around it. And that has transformed some aspects of Australian environmental policy. So I would say that was reasonably rational, based on the leadership of a single individual who had some powerful advisors. But I also see that sometimes the only way to get anything done is through chaos, like a fire, or when Peter Beattie brought in land clearing reforms. As far as I can tell, that was largely driven by the fact he was trying to cover up a massive scandal in his own party. So, chaos and scandal, fires, things that you're trying to cover up, opportunistic events seem to also drive. So, has anybody ever done an analysis? An honest analysis, not an analysis that's politically correct, an honest analysis of how we get good policy. How long it takes between the scientists saying land clearing is stupid, going back to 1985 or 1926, if you like, and you finally get something, and what actually precipitates the final process towards getting towards a policy that actually means it. Are those stories well told and analysed in the literature?
No, it's a classical. It's a classical problem of political science. That's what political science does, is to study how policy is made. But the idea from outside the discipline is that policy is a rational, linear process, like the policy cycle, and it's not. Policy, mostly they are stable. They only change when you have some focusing events, like the bushfires or the shootings in Port Arthur that made John Howard enact a new guns legislation. So this is one explanation. Is the policy punctuated equilibrium model. Policy is stable, and then there's something that happened, and all the dots align, and then it's changed. There are other models that explain policy as the different advocacy groups, conservationists, media, the farmers, they all fight to get their policy preference translated into actual policy. So it's,
Is there a good paper, I suppose? Is there one, if you were to read these two papers, which is an analysis of environmental policy change in Australia, do you think there's one, or anywhere, that actually explains this to me, or anybody?
You can read Understanding Public Policy,
Yeah.
a textbook by Paul Kearney, which summarises all of the many theories of the policy process, which are...
With good examples from Australia.
Well, he's Scot, so no.
Good examples from any in the world.
But there's a vast public policy and political science literature.
Yeah.
This might require diving into different journals than what we're going to
so that just talk.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, good. I just like the 2 or 3 months or so. I don't read too much.
And also part of the part of the workshop that we are planning now is just to explain how policy doesn't work like we think it does.
Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
But yeah, this is what the scholarship on political science is just several models trying to explain about how policy change or not changing, what precipitates.
Is your center the one that's looking at policy on bringing gene drives into Australia?
Yeah.
And do you have a lot of what are considered to be highly controversial policies that you're looking at now? I mean, is that when you're looking at innovative policy? I mean, that's groundbreaking and simultaneously going to raise all sorts of craziness.
Yeah.
So, do you have a lot of policies at the center that you're looking at like that? Because everything that groundbreaking is.
Yeah. No. What happens is that these emerging technologies, they're emerging and they're fast developing, and people are having different ideas on how to use it for conservation or other things applied to the environment. We have a project with Exeter, the University of Exeter. It's part of the UTREX, the institute. So that they specialize in gene drive, and they partner with us, and we got a grant, and we're going to look at the governance and policy challenges that need to be addressed before these things, someone allow these things to be used. So it's the same with the coral reefs. Like people are thinking of using these new technologies, but we don't have the policy and regulation to safely assess and make sound decisions in terms of if these things should be allowed or not. So this is an emerging area of research in terms of governance and policy. And even though these technologies, some of these technologies are 5-10 years away, we need to start the conversation now so we can get ready for when they're available and decide to use it. I know that IUCN, they have a working group that about to release a policy position in terms of use of synthetic biology for conservation. So the things are happening, they're coming, and we need to have the right regulations in place.
Is it okay if I just one more? You go.
I'm just wondering about the structure of the Centre for Policy Futures. So that middle one you had, it's looking after sustainability and conservation stuff. So is there like a team of people in the centre, or a person or a committee that is looking after that? Like, and where would, people like us go? How would we go to help get our science, policy relevant science, more into policy?
Yeah, we are too small to have. We usually do lots of stuff, but yeah. I work mostly with the environmental area. Karen, Ray works with sustainability in general.
So how many people are there in the centre? Is it just several people?
The course staff, I think, is 12, 14 people.
Oh, okay, got it. Yeah.
But we have affiliates.
Yeah.
But we're small, but very multidisciplinary. And but by all means, if you can contact me, and I can direct you to the right person. You have a question? Okay. Any other question?
You've been, looks like you've been working with Grumpa on this particular thing. How have you found the interactions with them?
Very good, because I think they're very open to get help, because they know these things are coming, and they don't have the right arrangements in place, so they need help, and they're open to. So we've been working with them, with other regulators, the gene technology regulator, the federal level, the Department of Environment Science, Queensland, the Department of Environment, Energy, and Canberra. Who else? Department of Agriculture and Fisheries. Yeah, because it's coming and they're not prepared. So we had a workshop that was very interesting last year or the year before. We have the scientists, the reef scientists in the room. We have the regulators and have the scientists explaining what they wanted to do, and the regulators said, what? You want to do what? But in the end, it was just like most of the issues were the problem of language. At this stage, the interventions are not that concerning. Things like genetic manipulation is 5-10 years away at best. So, but we need to have this conversation now. And they in response, they developed assessment guidelines to position them in terms of how they're going to assess these kind of interventions, trials for these interventions, and they review the guidelines now. So they've been they're very concerned and they open to get help. Any other questions? If not, thank you.